I call this special meeting of the Snoqualmie City Council to order. And this pertains to auditor's exit interview. However, due to lack of quorum, the special meeting is adjourned. Now we're just going to have a regular exit interview by the auditor. Typically, it's just for the exit interview, talks to city staff and the city council members and the mayor. It will not be. I won't be inviting public comment. So with that, I'll turn it over to both of you. So would introduce yourself.
Sure. All right, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Christina Baylor, and I'm currently serving as the audit manager overseeing the City of Snoqualmie's audit. With me today is Haji Adams. He served as the assistant audit manager overseeing the supervision of all the work performed and the staffing that served on the city's audit. We're pleased to be here today to share our draft audit results for the fiscal year 2016 audit of the city. We have a number of documents that we'll walk through today. They're all draft until they become published on our website. Should any member of the city council or the mayor or the staff have questions as we walk through these documents, please don't hesitate to let us know. We want to make sure that we answer all your questions before we leave today and publish the city's reports. So with that, we'll get started. If everyone can open up their packet, I believe we have
just real quick,
sure.
So your name again?
Christina Baylor.
Christina, thank you. Just real quick so you know who's here.
Sure.
Councilor Jim Mayhew, Councilmember Peggy Shepard, our City Clerk Jody Bourne, Matt Larson, Mayor, our City Attorney Bob Sturbank, City Administrator Bob Larson, and Robert Kamuda, of course, our Finance Officer, or Director, sorry. And we have a couple of finance staff back there as well, too, Drew Pute and Jerry. Okay, thanks. Sorry about the
No, thank you. Okay, so what we'll do to begin our presentation today is have everyone open their packets. On the left-hand side of the document, you'll see a document that we refer to as the exit conference agenda. That's an overview of everything we'll be discussing today. And then on the right-hand side of the packet, you'll see copies of our draft audit reports that will be published on our website following our meeting today. So we'll begin with the exit conference agenda. Is everyone familiar with the services of the Washington State Auditor's Office, or would you like me to briefly discuss those?
I would like you to discuss it.
Sure. Yeah. So the Washington State Auditor's Office, we are appointed by the legislature to be the auditor of all public funds. What that means is any government that receives public dollars, we conduct an audit, state or local, and we do those on a cycle depending on the size of the organization. For the City of Snoqualmie, it's typically an annual cycle, and we do two types of audits. The first would be called a financial statement audit. The city is required to prepare an annual financial report that's due within 150 days after every fiscal year end. And we'll take a look at that report to make sure that the numbers are fairly stated and materially correct, and ultimately issue an opinion on those financial statements. That's very important to the city. You want an audit report with a good, clean opinion. Should the city ever need to go out for bonds, bond rating agencies will take a look at those audit reports as part of their process to issue a bond rating. And then also any other external user of the report would be looking for that clean opinion so that they can place reliance on the information included in it. The second type of audit that we conduct is called an accountability audit. The accountability audit is unique to Washington State. What it looks at is the city's compliance with state laws, regulations, contracts, agreements, your own policies and procedures, and then just in general, is the city adequately safeguarding public funds? It's typically limited to those items that have a financial impact, but it does cover items that would be not considered material for financial statements, but important to the taxpayers in the city. And then we also perform other audit services should they be needed by the city. One of those would be a federal grant compliance audit. That was not performed for fiscal year 2016 because the city was not required to receive one. The city did not expend enough federal funds to trigger a federal audit. All right. So with that, the results of our audit will cover the accountability audit and a financial statement audit, and we do have two reports for each audit that we'll be walking through. But before we do that, I'd like to turn it over to Haji, who would like to share some audit highlights after conducting the audit with city staff.
Great. So we just wanted to thank city staff for all their hard work while we're on the audit. They conduct their normal business, and then when we get in here to take a look at areas of audit, they're very, very helpful in getting us us documentation timely, and also helping answer our questions that we had as well. So we want to definitely do that. I also want to thank Bob Larson. He put in a lot of work as well, helping us obtain documentation and get connected with the correct individuals to conduct our audit as well. So we appreciate that.
Sure. So the next thing we're going to do is we're going to ask that everyone put the agenda off to the side, and we're going to begin walking through the draft audit reports, which will be published on our website. Before we begin, it's important to do a quick overview of the levels of recommendations that our office issues. So the most significant or highest level of reporting that our office has is called an audit finding. An audit finding is the only level of recommendation that would be included in the audit report, and the city would have the chance to respond if there was one. We're pleased to report that there are no audit findings for the city's fiscal year 2016 audit. That's a really good result in both the financial and the accountability audit. The next level down is called a management letter item. Management letters are not as significant as an audit finding. They are still considered to be significant in that we will issue a formal letter to the council and the mayor. They are not included in the report, but they are referenced in a simple sentence. We did have one management letter item that we'll be going through today in the accountability audit. There were no management letter items in the financial audit. And then our lowest level of reporting is something we call an exit item. An exit item is a very minor item. We liken them to housekeeping items. They're very common in the audit process. We do have several of those items, but those were discussed with management as we determined that exit items are typically appropriately addressed by management in the day-to-day operations, and they're not significant in any means. So we'll begin with the accountability report. Included in your packet, you will have a draft of the accountability report. There are a few items that will be changing in this report, as this was an early draft, but we'll walk you through the contents and let you know what items you can expect to be changed. They're very minor.
So see the accountability audit report tab. So that'll be the first report we'll go over. So if you turn to page 4 of the report, it has our audit results. So you'll see a paragraph up top. So this will just reference overall the areas that we looked at when we conducted the accountability audit here at the city of Snoqualmie. And you'll see also the sentence that says that we examined, except as described below, city operations complied with applicable state laws, regulations, and your own policies as well. And underneath that first paragraph, you'll also see another reference. It just says, as a reference above, we noted certain matters that Christina had discussed earlier with the management letter that we brought with us that we'll go over today. And it's just referenced in that second paragraph that are highlighted. So that date will change to today's date in the final report.
Okay.
This is just a draft copy right now. And it was related to consultant services contracts, state and business, city business and occupation taxes, and state business licenses for that particular item. And what you'll see below is a couple bulleted items. So these are the areas that we examined when we conducted our accountability audit. So we took a look at compliance with refunded bonds. So we made sure that those bonds that were refunded were compliant. We also took a look at financial condition, some key ratios for the city, just to make sure that financial condition was decent and that there were no going concerns for the city either.
OG, could you speak up a little bit louder,
Yep.
please?
Sure.
Thank you.
So the third area that we looked at was procurement. So we did take a look at compliance with public works projects awarded for the emergency generator for the sewer treatment facility. So we just made sure that bid law compliance was followed. All supporting documentation was retained as well, and we didn't know any issues in our review of that. We also took a look at payroll support for police overtime. So we did take a sample and looked at some police overtime, recalculated it, make sure it was correctly calculated, and that there was supporting documentation for all the overtime that was charged as well for the police that we took a look at. But we also did have some citizen hotline referrals that came through during the course of the audit. So we also took a look at these items while we were conducting our accountability audit. So we did review consultant services contracts and payments. So there's a couple of vendors that were questioned and also contracts that were questioned. And we took a look and reviewed those items. I'll go into more detail about that on the management letter when I go over that. We also did review vendor activities and services for certain vendors that citizens were concerned with. We did take a look at the payments, if there were any, and the businesses that were, or the business that was conducted with those vendors as well, just to make sure that they were in compliance as well with city operations and that they're valid expenditures for those. Now on the page 5, we have a couple more items that we took a look at. We took a look at I-9 form completion, just to make sure that those forms were being completed, that they were done as well, and also that that there was a process here that was followed for completing those I-9 forms. We did also take a look at compliance with the city and state B&O tax here at the city. I'll talk more about that when we go over our management letter today. And then the last item that we looked at was business license and permit reviews. So we looked specifically at a certain contract for business license permit reviews, just to see if that was in compliance, and took a look at the hotline referral citizen concerns and took a look at that as well. Are there any questions, Council? Mayor? All right. So the next document you'll see that has the management letter tab.
Or just really quickly before we move over to the management letter, the last few pages in the letter, on page 6, you'll see related reports. That will reference any related reports that will be issued at the same time as the accountability. In this case, we have a financial statement audit report that is also referenced. And then on page 7, we do include in our report information about the city. This is for the perspective of the users of the report. We just ask that the city take a moment to look through that information, since it is information about your city. We want to make sure it's accurate as possible. And also, given that this is a 2016 report, we want it to be accurate as of the end of 2016, not in 2018 where we are right now. So when you get a chance, if you see anything, please let us know. We want to make sure that is accurate before we get published. And then on the last day is information about our office, should any member of the public want to contact us as well. And that concludes the accountability report. So we'll set that off to the side. And now Haji will walk you through our management letter in the accountability audit.
Yes, so you'll see the management letter. It's addressed to the mayor and city council. Like we had said earlier, it's referenced in our accountability audit report.
And this document is not published on the website. It is a public document, but it will not be published. It's just referenced in the report.
So I'll kind of briefly go over the contents of the management letter. So we did take a look at a contracting agreement with Lizzie Billington. That was one of the contracts we did review that came in from the Citizen Hotline. We looked at the contract itself for 2015, 16, and 17, all the way through October. We reviewed monthly payments as well for that contract. And we also did look at the terms of the contract and determine if payments complied with the terms of the actual contract as well. So when we reviewed the contract, we saw that the contract stipulated that the contractor was to receive payment not to exceed $118,560, and also that the contractor would be paid $57 an hour. There's those two stipulations in the contract. So we were able to get support with regards to the total amount in the 173.31 hours of work for the contract. The work was actually done. So it does show that the coordinator was charging the city the prorated maximum amount for the contract. So the not to exceed amount of the contract wasn't exceeded. And then we did find out that without actually basing the invoices on actual hours worked, it didn't exceed the contract either. And we also we reviewed 30 payments, 27 invoices totaling $266,000 for billed to the city for end month. The contract stipulated that the work would be conducted first before it was billed. So we did note that all hours claimed were actually worked. It's just that the invoices came in a little bit early and were paid early, but the actual work was performed in the contract.
And to clarify this item, the main item that we identified was there appeared to have conflicting contract terms in the contract. There were stipulations in the contract that allowed for a maximum amount to be paid. There were also stipulations that the contractor should be being paid based on actual hours worked. Beginning in 2016, we began to see that the hours were the same every month, and that the invoices started to come in before month's end. And so while there were stipulations in the contract that did allow for that to occur, there were also stipulations that made us question whether that should have occurred in that way. So our recommendation in that point would be to make sure that the contract terms are not conflicting to support the actual amounts being paid.
Question, I didn't follow that. If the contract permits something, why would you question it?
Because there was another piece of the contract that stated otherwise.
So what's your conclusion?
So that our conclusion is that it is allowable, but that in the future, the city needs to ensure that the contract terms do not conflict with one another. So in one case, when the contract is requiring that the amount being paid should be based on actual amount worked, and in the other case, it's saying the amount cannot exceed this time. When we started to see the invoices in all months came out to 173.31 hours, and the invoices were coming in before month's end, it did not appear to comply with that term that it should be based on actual hours worked and be paid for after the work was being done.
So I'm finding this to be very confusing. I just would like to get a clear answer from you. Did we comply with the contract or did we not?
You complied with the portion of the contract that allowed you to pay up to $118,560.
So are we in compliance or not?
Not with the second phase, and that's what gives the appearance that it could be
So you're unable to
conflicting.
make a conclusion? You can just tell us that there's a conflict, which we already knew?
Right. We're confirming that piece. So that could offer the question on that, but it was within the maximum allowable and the work was performed. So we're not saying that the amount was being questioned.
So really, there's nothing that was wrong, it's just a matter of it looks suspicious, is that right?
It doesn't look that it meets all the requirements of the contract, but the work was performed and it was within the maximum allowed.
Okay.
Okay, so
So should I just conclude that you're not reaching a conclusion on this? We need some further work to get to you can't conclude, or you're concluding?
We're
I just
concluding.
don't understand.
We are concluding on this matter that the contract terms conflict with one another, but the contract was not exceeded, so it was allowed. So you have to, the recommendation going forward is that the city ensure that the contract terms do not conflict with one another so that you can ensure payments are adequately supported and within the allowed amount.
Yeah, you may want to look around the room. I have a bunch of citizens in the city here. There's a bunch more that I represent. And I don't know how to answer the question based on what you just said
Yeah.
as to whether this contract was complied with or this contract was not complied with.
Well, it's not a straight answer. It's with the contract, the payments are supported and they're allowed by the contract. That's the end conclusion.
That'll-
But the terms are conflicting. So,
Regardless, I'm gonna treat it as that we drifted away from how the contract should have been implemented. We reviewed that thoroughly and we fully intend to correct that in the future.
okay. And there were a couple of related items related to this contract that were also reviewed. So I'll let Haji continue with those items.
All right, so you'll see the paragraph below. So in addition, we also found that the event coordinator didn't have a state of Washington business license, and state regulation requires that a state business license be obtained by the vendor. Further, we noted the event coordinator didn't pay P&O tax, and they should have under Snoqualmie's municipal code as well.
I have a question. Is it the requirement of WAC 458-20-101 that the city is to enforce the requirement for a state business license?
The city is not, but when we reviewed it, it was just another item that was identified, and that when your process of doing business, just something to be aware of to make sure you do business with.
It's what I'm trying to get clear of, because we're gonna follow up with the administration. So I'm trying to get clear, does the administration, does the city have a requirement to do something here that they have not done, or does the city not have a requirement here? Is this a state requirement that is not a city requirement?
It is a
This is a state requirement. This is a state requirement.
All right, so the city hasn't failed in any duty or failed to comply with the law. It's more that a vendor is, and you're suggesting that the city might want to play some role in that, but you're not saying that the city has failed to comply with any requirements.
No, no.
So it's a recommendation to tighten our, again, a language in the contract to specify that you must
Right.
be licensed with, and make that very clear, and then
It's just there's a risk involved if you do, conduct business with vendors that don't have state licenses, right? So it just increases your risk of doing business.
Bob, do you wanna speak to the payment of the, 534 code?
No, I just was just tracking this thing, but it appears that if we ensure that they have a state business license, then we could obviously, it could follow on that they would ensure that they're gonna be reporting the B&O, at least from our side. But we already knew that we weren't getting that. Anecdotally, we've been pressing the particular individual, and she claims that she does not required to have a business license, nor is she required to file for B&O, for state or local.
Per her attorney's advice, and I kept requesting them give me something written from the attorney to have us look into.
And so if I could-
But regardless,
So if I could add to this, the point I'm trying to get at is you hear from the city administrator and the mayor, is I'm concerned with unfunded state mandates. So now, are we expected as a city, you're recommending that we put a requirement in that state laws, which we actually have no responsibility to do, and now we're gonna spend a bunch of city resources on city taxpayer dime to enforce a law that we're not, it sounds like, really very clear how we even could enforce. So I just wanna get clear, it seems to me that this is not a city requirement. And I'm very reluctant to see us being told that we should take on a state enforcement requirement that is unfunded and that we don't have to take on.
Right, so to Haji's point, the city is required to ensure that all vendors that you conduct business with have met all associated
So
requirements.
that was my question, I may have misunderstood the answer.
So-
So we are required under 45820-101 to ensure that anyone we do business with has a state license.
It's a best practice. This statute is governing the vendors and ensuring that they have to get this. But the city, by not ensuring that certain criteria are met, or that taxes are paid, or that licenses are obtained, it exposes the city to risk.
What risk?
Yeah.
Risk in ensuring that if they didn't have a valid business license and that there was a claim, the city could potentially, there could be some liability associated with
Well,
that.
is there or isn't there liability?
We don't know, not in this case.
But you're making a recommendation that we incur costs and you don't even know if we have liability.
We're making a best practice recommendation that the city ensure that the vendors that you conduct business with have met all appropriate requirements to conduct business with the city. In one case, this vendor does owe B&O tax to the city and then also to the state.
I'm not asking about B&O, I'm asking about the license.
But they're associated.
Well, I'm very confused by your answer.
I like your answer. Just
In
let
any
you
case,
know.
then this, part of this is a best practice recommendation. What you have is you have a vendor here that, there were questions being raised by the public about it. When we looked into it, the audit found that there were similar questions. And so we are bringing those to your attention so that the city can improve its internal controls going forward and ensure that all appropriate items are maintained.
I guess it begs the question, Councilmember Mayhew, of whether or not the city council would want us to, if you want to adopt a policy that would require us as part of our standards for having a business in town, whether or not they're going to have a state business license in order to conduct that business. But that would be begging the question here, if she didn't have that state business license, could she still have been our event coordinator? Or should we have ceased allowing her to do the work, and we should have looked at perhaps even having the contract terminated because of that? I would say no, because we're not required to ensure that she had that state business license, but we are required to ensure that she's paying, if she has an obligation to pay B&O tax to the city.
Yeah, absolutely, that's exactly where my thoughts are. And then there's a further question that follows on from that, is if we are going to attempt to enforce this state law about business licenses, those licenses don't have an indefinite life, they have a very definite life, which means we're gonna have to have employees engaged in a tracking process to see when those licenses are expiring, follow up to make sure they're renewed. We're taking on a whole enforcement process on behalf of the state that isn't paid for by the state and doesn't appear to be required by the state. So, I'm very concerned about things like our B&O tax not getting into our coffers, but this one is confusing to me.
And the question I had is, do we even have access to verify? Because I've heard some concerns that from other jurisdictions that sometimes they can't get access to the state licenses. So is there one place we can go, say our counter clerk can go and actually verify that license?
Yeah, so that would be something that included in our recommendation. We're recommending that the city work with the Department of Revenue on this matter and determine what criteria you want to set to establish and before you engage in business with the vendor, and then also what access, if you decide that you are gonna check state B&O licenses before you engage, what avenues would be available to you to do that.
And maybe that's the next topic on the B&O, but I did want to say that we've withheld final payments to this vendor until this B&O issue is resolved, so we don't anticipate any financial damage to this.
Sure. That's great.
Can I just ask, just a point, and you may not be the person to ask this to. On this estimated $534, let's assume, I assume the city's in agreement with that.
We are.
That's, I assume, yeah, so the city is in agreement with that. Do we have a mechanism to enforce payment of that? How is something like that enforced?
Under the current situation, this particular vendor, we've withheld the final payment.
Yeah, I'm clear on this
Yeah.
vendor that you have some
Yeah.
leverage, but generally speaking,
How would we do it? Well, if they don't have a business license, or they aren't paying B&O taxes, we should cease to have that relationship with the ultimate, but, yeah.
you don't have a way to go grab the money for past B&O taxes that they owe,
We would have
it's a
to,
voluntary.
we'd have to bring a legal action.
Oh, so
for
there is a
collection.
legal enforcement process we could go through?
Yes.
Thank you.
So I have a question about the, having a state license. Do you recommend that if we start working with someone, that we recheck to see if their license is still current? Or, I mean, you would do more than just check when you first hire them, you would,
We'd have to do an annual check.
you would have
based
to
on the
check
date.
a
You'd have to do a
certain
monthly
frequency,
check.
yeah. I don't know, is that in your
I think
letter?
it depends on how often you engage services from the vendor. If it's an annual item, then you'd want it every time you go to re-engage the services of the vendor, you'd want to make sure whatever process the city has put into place to do the checks are completed.
Okay,
Because the license should be good for 1 year, correct? I
That's,
guess.
yeah,
Typically.
That's my understanding.
okay,
That'd be
so
1 year
then,
from when it was issued,
Yes.
so when
Right.
we start doing, we have
No
many
idea.
vendors we do business with, all of which are gonna have different license periods and renewal dates, and
Hundreds of
we
them.
may do multi-year contracts, like I think there's I'm gonna call it lawn mowing, but that's not the right term.
Maintenance.
Maintenance
Landscape
contract,
maintenance,
that's, I think it's something like 5 or 6 years long, so we'd have to have a whole process going on an ongoing
Garbage hauling
basis.
contracts, we've got consultant contracts that are, they just roll from year to year.
So this could be a somewhat expensive process to implement. You know, if
Yes.
it's if it's a B&O tax enforcement, I think that's one thing. If it's something that doesn't produce money for us but costs us money, I'm more unclear on it.
it'd be good to find out what what the actual investment of time would be.
Yeah.
Instead of assuming it's a big deal, it may be nothing, yeah.
It clearly takes staff resources. We're talking about not dozens, we're talking about literally hundreds of vendors that we'd have to check on. And then they would roll out each month, depending on when that license was pulled in the state. 1,000, thank you, yeah, we actually have over 1,000. So I can assure you, I can't say with pinpoint accuracy the number of hours, but it'd be considerable for us to spend staff resources on that. Unless there was some type of a self-check. Maybe the vendor, as part of their license requirement to be working in the city, would have to produce that and show us they've got it every single year.
Which is what.
The problem is we still have to check on it. Eventually, we have to do the check.
Department of Revenue website. So you can check on the Department of Revenue website
Mhm.
if they have a valid license.
Supposed
So
to be
that's
there.
one, sometimes cities will do just a quick lookup, just like as if you were having a procurement contract or something like that, where you wanna say, oh, are they bonded, for example, right? So those kind of searches. So you can go on the Department of Revenue website and type in the vendor name and see if they do have a valid state business license.
So maybe you don't appreciate the hypotheticals, but let's say we got into a two-year contract with a vendor. As part of the stipulation of the contract, they had to be licensed with the state. They produced that, we see their license, and we move forward. And unbeknownst to us, 10 months into the contract, their license expires, they didn't get it renewed. In that second year, we have an audit, you guys find it, or someone brings to our attention that they're not licensed with the state. What's your position on that? Are we still
So
Is
we are
that a management
strictly.
letter, is that
No.
a failure, is that,
No,
what's your?
yeah, we're strictly a reporting agency. If we identify noncompliance, we're required to bring it to your attention.
So you see it as non-compliance from the vendor or non-compliance from the city, or the city should still be to Councilmember Mayhew?
If the city has a process, that your process or a policy or a procedure or a contractual term is to ensure that the vendor has met certain requirements, and we see a requirement that's not met, then we'd have to bring it to your attention.
Well, I'm
So-
saying it was met at the time the contract's put into
Right.
place.
So it depends on what your process is. So, right now, I don't know that there is a process in place. This was a specific citizen concern, that this vendor did not have this license. We were able to validate that that's true. And so we're just bringing that to your attention, but it's not a primary area that we look into, is the licensing of vendors, because that's a Department of Revenue oversight. That's an area that they review. We were just reviewing the specific item for this vendor.
I guess I was trying to just explore the resource issue that Councilmember Mayhew
Yeah.
raised, that it would seem rather easy to implement that procedure at the beginning of a contract, but then to try to track when those licenses might expire through the duration of a contract becomes perhaps more resource intensive or
Sure.
consuming.
Yeah.
So I'm just curious from your perspective, you're saying, hey, you entered into good faith, they produced everything, your procedure did it, but are you gonna expect us best practices, not quite law,
Yep.
isn't law this requirement, that we're gonna be every month checking or cataloging all these different
Yeah.
contracts and whatever months they expire and making sure to check in and,
That,
you understand
that
the
sounds
you understand the
reasonable to
difference?
us, yeah. Yeah.
So it's kind of I guess trying to strike a balance there, reasonable procedures, but not getting overly encumbering the city excessively with that, given that that is a state requirement.
Sure. So that, I mean, in all cases, the city has to make a decision on what's the best use of your resource and what's the risk. So in this case, we would recommend that the city work with the Department of Revenue, determine what the risk is. If the risk isn't there for the city, then you can, create your procedures to address that.
Could
But-
you give us a scenario or an example of a risk, I mean, where we might be liable for some taxes they didn't pay, or, I mean, what would be the?
This is not our purview that we deal with often. That's a Department of Revenue question. I have seen them, work with governments and impose penalties, but I don't know if that would happen in your case. Typically, what we see is this requirement is similar to the requirement to make sure a vendor is not suspended or disbarred. So if you engage services with a vendor, if there's potential risk, I don't know if the city is taking on any of that risk by engaging those services and not checking
Yeah,
that.
I'm just having a hard time grasping what the risk would be, other than you guys saying, hey, this wasn't best practices.
Right. So, and we don't know the answer to that question yet. So this was a specific issue that was brought to our attention by the citizen. We're just notifying you that the vendor did not have a state business license.
Right.
And so if the city wants to create your procedures to check for that in the future, you can, but in terms of what risk it is for the city, we would recommend that you work with the Department of Revenue or your attorney.
All right. You're suggesting they could give us an example of where it might
They would
result in
know.
a financial risk for the city? Because right now I can't conceive of a financial
Right.
risk for us, because it would seem to be between the state and the vendor, and would never involve them coming back to the city saying, you owe the state or you owe the vendor.
Right.
I can't think of any scenario. And you're not aware of one offhand?
No, it's not something that we
Okay.